Hey everyone, at 7:01, I think we can get started. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Pratik Karat. I am the chair of the Fairfax NAACP's Criminal Justice Committee. The reason why we're here is a couple weeks ago, we condemned the Fairfax County Police Department for unilaterally releasing a foot pursuit policy without input from the Equity Action Team, a community group formed through the One Fairfax Roundtable at the request of Chief Kevin Davis. The NAACP stated that FCPD disregarded ongoing dialogue and failed to incorporate critical community feedback, particularly around racial disparities and public safety. We criticize the policy for lacking clear limits on when foot pursuits are justified and for ignoring repeated calls to prioritize safer, community-based alternatives. Concerns especially urgent given the documented disproportionate impact on Black and Latino residents. This breakdown in the collaboration process erodes public trust and makes future policy reform efforts significantly more difficult. I'm going to pass it to my vice chair on the Criminal Justice Committee, Matthew.
Hey, I'm Matt. I just wanted to mention that I guess I also was on the Equity Action Team. We're going to call it the EAT that was asked to look into the pursuit policy, and I'm pleased that we have a couple of other members of that EAT with us tonight to give you their perspectives on what happened in the policy. I've worked with both them previously on other reform efforts, and I think their perspectives on the community, based on the work that they've done with the community, will be really valuable tonight. So I'm just going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Pastor Walton, if you want to go first.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Pratik and Matthew, for providing this opportunity, and certainly to President Zimmerman. My name is Vernon Walton. I'm the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of Vienna. As you've indicated, I'm a member of the One Fairfax Roundtable, as well as I also had the opportunity to serve on the Equity Action Team for this particular effort as it relates to the foot pursuit policy.
Brian, you want to hop in and give us your background?
Sure. Hi, I'm Brian Kennedy. Thank you again for having me here. My day job, I'm a senior assistant public defender in Fairfax County. I've been there about 13 years. I'm also on the board of an organization called Justice Forward Virginia. We do criminal legal system reform work throughout the state, but we do a lot of policy work and legislative work through them.
Awesome. I do want to say that the chat is open throughout this conversation tonight. Feel free to enter your questions, and time permitting at the end, we'll see which questions we can get to and have answered. But yeah, I think we can hop right into it. So, Pastor Walton, can you just discuss how or why a foot pursuit policy is needed? What happened that led to all the community pressure that got us to this point where we need a policy such as this?
Well, I think there's several reasons why a foot pursuit policy was needed, but I'll focus specifically on the events of February 22nd, 2023. And unfortunately, Pratik, as you are well aware, and many of the individuals who are watching, that was the date that unfortunately Timothy Johnson lost his life. Timothy Johnson was at that particular time alleged to have shoplifted from Nordstrom's. There was an event that took place that led the officer to chase Timothy Johnson outside across the street into the woods. And as a result of that foot pursuit policy and the other events that took place, ultimately, Timothy Johnson was shot and killed outside of the store. As a result of that killing, the need for a foot pursuit policy, there were already some conversations that were taking place, but at that particular moment, the conversation escalated. And there were lots of questions, lots of concerns about the loss of life over sunglasses. There were lots of questions and concerns about how this could have been handled differently so that everyone could have gone home that night. Lots of questions about dangers to other members of the community during a police pursuit, as well as dangers potentially to the officers that are engaged in the pursuit. And so that conversation escalated. And in addition to that, as we followed the case, I think it's important to note as well, those who watched the press conferences that were held thereafter by the family of Timothy Johnson. Repeatedly, one of the things that Timothy Johnson's mother said, that she was hopeful that there was some good that would come out of this death, out of her son's death. We're well aware, and she was well aware, that Timothy would not come back. He would not be returning home. But her prayer, her hope was, and many of us joined her in that hope, that there could be some good. And one of the things specifically she indicated was that there would be a foot pursuit policy. Last thing I will say is this, that Fairfax County prides itself on being a trendsetter and prides itself on being forerunners. And so there are not many departments, not only in the state of Virginia, but across the country, that have very clear and explicit foot pursuit policies. And so there was definitely a need for one here.
No, yeah, I totally understand that. I joined the Criminal Justice Committee here right about the time the Timothy Johnson incident happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, foot pursuits happen all the time though, and they definitely affect Black and Latino populations disproportionately. So, Brian, in your experience as a public defender, I'm sure you've seen a variety of different cases that showed a need for a policy. Maybe there's some experiences that you could speak to about why we need a policy such as this.
Yeah, I guess the first thing to note is that foot pursuit policies don't affect cases that often. General orders, which is what this is, the police department has a ton of them. Just because a police officer violates a general order doesn't mean that they won't be able to go forward with the case or anything like that. It's also interesting when you cross-examine police officers to say they violated a general order. A lot of times they say, we have a lot of general orders. I don't know what that general order says. Or, yeah, I follow general orders, but I also follow what my field training officer said. So in terms of the impact they have actually on a legal case, it's pretty small. And the other part of it is that a lot of the most egregious foot pursuits are foot pursuits that don't lead to a criminal charge, right? Mr. Johnson's police report did not lead to a criminal charge against him because he was deceased. We would never see that in the court system, but for the Commonwealth Attorney decided to prosecute that case. People who are chased who there was no reason to chase them, those don't come across our desk. So we don't even see the worst examples, which creates a weird kind of bias on our side. But foot pursuit policies are obviously important because of the loss of life, which Pastor Walton talked about. But they are important about what they're trained. The police officers are trained at the academy because they're trained based off those general orders. And I think about setting a culture from the top, to the extent a police department can be influenced by that, which I think there can be. And we saw that with various changes that came about after 2020, both legislative and policy-wise in the department. So I think that's important. And one thing that another member of the EAT said often, Mr. Carter, was the impact that, and you talked about it, Pratik, the impact not only that it has disproportionately on Black and Brown communities in the county, but the impact that seeing someone in the community be chased through the neighborhood has on everyone else in the neighborhood. And when we know unjustified police stops make people less likely to vote in the future, from studies going through all of that, we know it has a great impact on people who are being stopped, but also the people who see them being stopped and the culture it creates in our neighborhoods, which is equally important. So both inside the courtroom and outside, there are a lot of reasons why it was important to have a foot pursuit policy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely a lot of reasons. I know I kind of mentioned race earlier, and we do have some data about race. I know Matt has worked a lot with a lot of different data related projects here at the NAACP, and maybe you could speak a little bit about uh, some data points regarding foot pursuits and how it affects different populations.
Yeah, I can do that. So kind of do data analysis for a living, and so I kind of took on the role of handling the data, making data requests, and analyzing the data that we receive from the department as part of the EAT. And I mean, what we found was that there's really huge disparities in who is actually pursued. If you look at FCPD's dashboard that they published, it looks like 53% of people who are pursued are white, which technically is accurate. But more is, if you look at actually break that down by Hispanic and non-Hispanic, you see that only 9.5% are Latino or are white non-Hispanic. So that leaves a giant percentage left, which 87.5% of those pursued are Black and Latino, which is just kind of shocking, and raises some red flags that really need to be looked into and addressed, and not just as part of a foot pursuit policy, but as part of continuing to follow up on this, and continual monitoring of the situation, which was a very important concern of the EAT. Additionally, as one might expect, you additionally see large disparities in where foot pursuits happen. I think it's like over just about half of foot pursuits happen in 2 districts, police districts around the county, Mount Vernon district and Mason district. Mount Vernon district being kind of around the Route 1 corridor.
Yeah. So let's move on and talk more about the specifics of what actually transpired here. So, Pastor Walton, could you discuss your involvement the with the EAT and how the EAT was formed and how the roundtable came about and how like the community pressure led to these it, organizations that worked on policies?
Right. So again, Pratik, I think context is always important. So many who live in Fairfax County know that the county itself adopted a one Fairfax policy. And so what that simply means is that the county leadership says that equity is extremely important, and that every policy, every decision that is made is done through an equity lens. Having said that, there have been several committees, several opportunities that I've had to work on county committees as it relates to equity issues, dating back to 2020, which I was a member of the chairman's task force on equity and opportunity. And that particular committee actually recommended this particular body to the supervisors. The recommendation was that the county needed to create a body that would deal with, that would speak to, that would wrestle with these issues around equity, not just in terms of policing, but whether it was housing, whether it is economic development, all of the equity issues that exist in Fairfax County. Fast forward 2023, I also served as a member of Supervisor Rodney Lusk community matrix group. It was that particular group was in response to the events that happened in St. Louis. Many were concerned around the country about the racial uproar and unrest, and there were questions raised about how we were doing policing here in Fairfax County. Subsequently, there was a request for recommendations about how we should deal with the equity issues here in Fairfax County. Supervisor Lusk assembled a group of people, and our job, our responsibility was to synthesize, go through all of these recommendations and that were submitted by members of the community, and then ultimately make some recommendations based upon the voices of community members to the supervisor, Lusk himself, and then ultimately to the entire board of supervisors, Supervisor Lusk being the chair of public safety. So having served on those 2 committees, both of those committees made recommendations. We were really concerned about where these recommendations were going and what happened to the recommendations. Are they shelved? Is there a body that actually reviews these recommendations and put them into practice and makes them policy? Well, the One Fairfax Roundtable was birthed out of all of those discussions, and the roundtable was really designed and birthed to be the body that helps the Board of Supervisors to wrestle with these equity issues. The roundtable, does its work through equity action teams. Equity action teams are smaller working groups that are developed around specific subject matter, and the equity teams are designed to do just as I've suggested, to understand the factors that contribute to equity challenges here in Fairfax County, and the teams either contribute or collaborate to help develop policy and or strategy. This particular equity action team was requested by the Fairfax County Police Department to look at this foot pursuit policy. And so as a result of the police department making the request, the team is then developed. The team is made up of roundtable members, as well as additional community members, whether they have lived experience, professional experience around the issue. They come together to either, again, collaborate or contribute to help develop policy and or strategy. I think it's also important to note that this foot pursuit policy was the very first equity action team established of the roundtable. And I think that's important to note because, as you well know, that means that this first team sets precedents. This first team gives us a real sneak peek into what the future looks like. And so this first equity action team was extremely important, not only because of the subject matter, but because indeed it was the absolute first team. The team is developed, and we had our very first meeting in December of 2024. And I will tell you, as Brian can attest, there were lots of meetings beyond that. As Matt can also attest to, I believe we had about 19 meetings, and not to mention the number of hours that those 19 meetings made up. Again, these teams are made up of volunteers. They are working, some are retired, but they're giving their time and their service to work on these issues. We had 19 meetings. We had some joint meetings with the Fairfax County the Police Department, primarily with the deputy chiefs, and lots of conversations. If we had 19 meetings, there had to be thousands of emails and hundreds of sidebar conversations as we attempted to make sense out of the data and the information that we were processing. So we were working smoothly, and we really thought that we had a pretty good rhythm. And we were well aware that we were not writing the policy, but because we were invited to this space, we were invited to collaborate and to contribute, that we wanted to take this seriously, and because we represented the community. And there was give and take. We would go back and forth. We'd have meetings, we'd make recommendations, and then we would process, synthesize those recommendations. Police department would come back, share with us how they felt about those recommendations. Some of those were adopted, and those that were not adopted, there would be some dialogue around them. And this went on for quite some time. Our last meeting with the police department took place on the 24th of March. And that last meeting, again, went well. We left that meeting with some issues that needed to be resolved in terms of some final decisions, but we were looking forward to coming back to the table. On April the 1st was our last full roundtable meeting, and the chair of the Equity Action Team gave a report to the full roundtable and essentially said, things are going smoothly. We're on a path to completing our work. There's been great conversation and dialogue between the team and the department. And so we left that meeting feeling pretty good about our work product. Unfortunately, soon thereafter, something happened. That meeting was on the 1st. On April the 4th, there was a press release released by the police department, which essentially said that that the foot pursuit policy had been adopted. And quite honestly, Pratik, we thought that it was an accident. There was a mistake, that this could not be the case. It was released on the 4th and scheduled to be effective on the 9th. And so many of us, obviously, shocked by what we were reading on social media and email, began to reach out to each other and began to reach out to the county, specifically to the office of the chief equity officer, to make sure that we didn't miss anything, or to get a sense of whether or not this was actually accurate and or a mistake. And unfortunately, we learned that it was accurate, that it was true, that it was released, and it was released without any conversation with the Equity Action Team, was released without any conversation with the Equity Officer's office. It was released without any opportunity for us to respond, and no real explanation for that release having taken place. And so, needless to say, we were extremely disappointed because, as far as we were concerned, we were still very much engaged in the process. There were still some questions and there were some issues on the table. There were still some things that needed to have some closure to them, but we were not given the courtesy, nor, quite frankly, the respect to finish that particular process.
No, yeah, that's a great answer and really does give us the full context behind what happened. Um, this goes out to you or Brian. Um, with this like erosion of trust, how FCPD didn't really follow through on getting this feedback from leaders in the community, experts in the community. Do you think you'd ever even want to serve on a future group such as this? Do you think that would lead somewhere? And if this were to happen again, uh, whether it's through another EAT or some other mechanism, how would you do things differently to ensure FCPD is held accountable throughout the process?
Well, I'm Brian. Want to jump in or? Okay, I think that's a great question, Pratik, and I think many are wrestling with that question because the truth is it's not a closed issue for us. We did have a meeting, and there was representation from the county executive's office that came to our meeting, and there was an apology extended. But the apology that was extended, I want to be clear, was specifically for the release etiquette. The apology was specifically for the release etiquette. And that alone is still very troubling because the issue of trust is not solely around, the timing of the release. The issue of trust is about how we are viewed as partners and the value of that partnership. And that's what's at stake here. Are the community, residents really partners in this work? Again, this was the first EAT. Obviously, there are some things that we can do differently, but what prohibits this from happening again, whether it's with the Fairfax County Police Department with another EAT, or whether it's the economic, development engine coming to the table and deciding that they walk away. The question, trust means there's mutual respect. Trust means that there is an opportunity for mutual engagement and mutual feedback. And that's the piece that was missing. And quite honestly, that was missing not only in the apology, but I read the response to the letter from the NAACP, and there was also an apology about the timing of the release. That does not speak to the core of the issue that's at hand.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Um, so
Do you want to
how?
give Brian a chance to respond as well?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Mhm.
was. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the whole process and the breakdown of trust?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with Pastor Wallen. I mean, finding out on Twitter something that we'd spent hours and hours and hours for, yeah, that was troubling. But the more troubling thing was I felt like the last meeting we had with the police, we'd finally gotten down to the real heart of kind of these issues and narrowed through a lot of the other stuff and had, I think, a difficult productive meeting with them where we finally figured out, like, here's where we think the real important issues are. Here's your problems with them. How can we find a way forward? And then for a week later, that to be thrown away. And in terms of affecting if you'd serve again, it's as Walton said, how much time we spent. I don't even want to know how much time Matt spent on the data stuff. It was more than the rest of us, but it's time away from our families. It's time away from our jobs that we were doing for community service, and to not have the important issues being taken up at the end does make it. I mean, for example, I don't think I'd serve on an EAT again unless I knew things were going to be different in the structure, or I knew things up front were going to be different. And obviously, it was the first one; it was a learning experience, right? As we'd said, I think if it were structured differently, but having served on other county groups, even with the police department, things that were a co-production model were more difficult, but went a different way. And I felt like our input was more valued there. This model, where I thought it had some value, it would be, again, without a lot of changes. I think I would have real questions about doing it because I felt in some ways that we were a rubber stamp. We were a nice thing to say, oh, we convene in the AT, and that's nice that we did that in Equity Action Team, and they reviewed it, when the police department wouldn't even, in our meetings, admit that the demographic issues were, for example, which was a troubling, in addition to the trust issues and how it went down, troubling in terms of the engagement from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think I would add that I think from the beginning, some of us were concerned that this was a rubber stamp situation, that the police department wanted to be able to say they were with the first EAT. And I really think the most shocking, the one thing that made it extremely shocking, I think, for all of us, was that although there was some friction in the last meeting, specifically regarding data, but in terms of our other recommendations, the meeting ended with Deputy Chief Hines saying all our recommendations were reasonable. Some of them would require a culture change, but they were all perfectly reasonable, and that he would, talk to the chief and get back to us. So to have it come out a few days later, I saw it through an email that Brian sent out, and just like it's already being released without any comment or discussion with us as to what was going on or why they were doing that. Really just makes you not trust your ability to work with them in the future, for sure.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, let's move on talk about the specifics about what the policy entails, what the foot pursuit policy does. So Brian, with the policies that FCPD has now implemented, what are some of the positive changes? What are some of the changes that were more neutral and ones that could have gone further? Um, so yeah, what are your thoughts on the things, like your objective thoughts on what they put out?
I mean, in terms of the foot pursuit policy that they implemented, obviously they have one, so that's good. And they have one that I think I think the best part about it is the supervisor input parts that they had in there, that the supervisor is required to become involved in the pursuit early and take charge of it, and presumably would then have the ability to stop it if it were not going. That's not as express as we wanted in there, and nothing really was as expressly laid out in there. But those are objectively good parts of the policy. Other things that are good, although we'll get to data in a little bit, is that they have a public dashboard that they're creating with some data on there that would be updated frequently, so that we as community members can look at that to the extent we can actually work with it. That's a little bit different. But look at that, and that's good. And that is transparent, and they'll tell you is more transparent than almost any other department in the country. So those are good. And giving some amount of guidance to patrol officers when they're being trained on the general order about what to look for in a foot pursuit policy is good. I'm not sure it goes much far beyond common sense, or what I hope they were being trained on anyway, but it is good to have it in writing, because obviously, as we saw in Mr. Johnson's case, common sense doesn't get us very far sometimes, and people can make really tragic decisions for individuals or the community. In terms of the feedback that the EAT had on the initial draft of the policy, which I should add, by the time we saw it, had already been run through the police union, which was one of the big troubles here, that we got it after that process was already done. So any changes, big changes we made would have to go back through the union before they could be approved by the police department. They'll tell you, if I'm sure some of the information that's out there, I think it was in the chairman's letter, they accepted X percentage of suggestions that we had about the policy. And I think as a matter of, we suggested a change and whether it was accepted or rejected, that is true. They're not lying about that. I think what underlies that, though, is that we made all sorts of recommendations to the policy, like, it wasn't quite insert a comma here, but things like that. This word should be added. This sentence doesn't make any sense. This part of this policy doesn't match this part of your other policy. Maybe they should say the same thing. So I think in terms of numbers and percentage of things that were accepted, a lot of those were things that were non-controversial or were non-central to the policy. That obviously makes it look like they accepted a lot of things that we suggested, but that didn't modify the policy in a fundamental way or address the actual equity issues that we were looking at in particular. In terms of things that they didn't accept, there were a few that were kind of the most important. And I want to start with the data piece, because I think we all agreed, I think it was at least the prevailing thought of the AT by the end, that the data piece was the most important, because that's what's going to allow, regardless of what policy they came up with, that we knew we wouldn't have control of at the end, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, that's what's going to allow the community to actually address if the policy is working, if it is reducing equity issues, if it is targeting certain neighborhoods, all of which we know it is, right, already, and if it makes a difference. We saw this with the Community Policing Act that was passed in 2021 about searches and vehicle searches, that we're able to look at that now years later with the data and address what other policy changes we need. And there were a lot of disagreements about what was possible and what they were willing to do. But some showed kind of the fundamental disagreements. We thought it was important, for example, that they record the demographics of both the person they were pursuing, right, the suspect, and the officer who was doing the pursuit. They had no idea why that was important. But obviously that is something that could lead to an interesting question that you could look at the data, whether it would mean something once you look at the data and did the analysis, we don't know, but we'll never even know we have the ability to ask the question, to look at it, unless we have the data. Because obviously it would be a concern if white officers and black officers were making different choices, or women officers and men officers were making different choices, right? Young officers, old officers making different choices. All of those, if they were statistically different, result there and make the choices they made with the foot pursuit could be something that you'd want to look into to see if there was a policy change. Injuries were another big one. Whether the officer was injured and then how severe the injuries were. They had an injury piece of it, but there's a difference between getting a scratch and getting a broken arm, and wanting to know what that is like in terms of the danger that's actually required. The police department didn't want to do that. Knowing the location fairly specific. They were body-worn cameras now that track GPS. They may not have the ability to do it right now, but to figure out where stop pursuits were starting and stopping, that you'd have a more kind of specific ideas about length and duration, that those could be important, whether they were able to capture that now or in the future. That was a big change. And also the ability to download and use the information. And Matt can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the portal they have right now, you can look at it and you can ask it questions, but you can't actually download that information to then run your own analysis of the data, which you would need to do anything interesting about it, other than looking through the constraints of their current form. We had a lot of conversations about where that was, the different pieces of the data that were already being collected, and then whether they were being collected in a way that was just in a narrative report. So in the police report, they'd say, we have all this data. We're saying, well, without capturing it in something that's other than thousands and thousands of police reports, no one's ever going to be able to use the data. And they wouldn't even give us the police reports, thousands of police reports, to try to replicate it ourselves, even if we wanted to, which was a problem from the very beginning of the EAT to get us the data to do our work, let alone in the future. Other things they disagreed with that we thought were important. We wanted more specific requirements for supervisors instead of these kind of general ideas, requiring supervisors to terminate foot pursuits if they found in their involvement they didn't have a lawful purpose or they weren't lawful. That we wanted them to consider in some ways limiting the amount of offenses that they could do a foot pursuit on, and we had a very low bar. Any crime you could basically possibly think of would have been above this bar. It'd be things like drunk in public or, things like that they shouldn't pursue people on, which I don't think would have made a big difference in terms of number of pursuits because it wouldn't come up very often, but it showed an unwillingness to draw a line anywhere about types of cases where they wouldn't put someone in the danger Mr. Johnson was in. If you're not even willing to say, I won't chase someone for being drunk in public to make sure neither the police officer nor the person being pursued will be injured or die, that was a policy difference that I thought was important. We had a recommendation that someone just running from the police, right, shouldn't be a reason for a foot pursuit. You have no reason, you just show up in a neighborhood, someone takes off running. The Supreme Court of the United States says you can chase someone for that in certain circumstances and it's lawful. One of our recommendations was let's not do that if we have no reason to chase somebody. And they wouldn't agree on that. And I think in the time we're living on now, our immigrant brothers and sisters right now are living in a time where seeing law enforcement can be very scary, for example, and there might be a whole host of reasons there are some people based off where they grew up, what their experiences with police officers, that have nothing to hide but are now being pursued simply because they want to avoid contact with a police officer. And we all know a million reasons why you might do that have nothing to do with criminal activity. So I think the data piece was the most important. And I said at the end, I'd give up everything else, every other recommendation we had for the data, even most of the data. Those other things I think show kind of where we were getting to with the policy differences and why they were important. And again, I think it's worth highlighting the fundamental disagreement. EAT member Mr. Carter again kept bringing it up. We're here to do an equity action team, and they won't even agree that demographic issues are problematic for any reason. So why do we have an equity action team to deal with equity issues if they won't even acknowledge that their disparate impact that we know they have from their own data is an issue? And we tried our best to get there, but obviously we didn't think we could get there close.
Okay, I think, yeah, so I was surprised by this, and this might be a good time for a question or two from the audience. Someone asked, Sherelle Carper asks, was the union a member of the EAT? I was surprised the union, the police union, was involved as much as they were in this process. So could you speak about more about their involvement?
Yeah, they were not a member of the AT. The police auditor was a member of the IT, kind of ex officio. Other members of the county kind of deal with this. Head of the Civilian Review Board was there and provided, I think, a lot of useful insight into law enforcement for us and their role. So I thought it was useful to have them there ex officio. The union comment, so I think I haven't read this, but my understanding from what people told us is in the last collective bargaining with the police union, part of what the police union was able to achieve in their collective bargaining was that they got input on policies that were going to impact their officers. And my understanding from what we were told was that the draft we received had already been vetted by the police union before we even saw it. So any policy going forward that the county does with the police do is going to have to be run through the union. That's neither here nor there. Well, it's both of those places actually, but not the topic for tonight. I think the issue was that any substantive change to the policy, what that meant, would have, for the police department, started a process where they needed to go back to the police union. They'd also use their community groups, district station community groups, to vet this as well, which are obviously a different composition than the EAT. But the police union would have had to basically go back to go through their approval. I don't know what that approval looks like. We weren't privy to that, whether they need police union approval for these changes or just input, or the same thing we had, which is we can talk at them and then they can ignore it. I'm not sure what level they were at, but certainly it would have had to have restarted a substantive prior process that they thought was already done. And how that weighed into their decision making, you'd have to ask them, but I think was worth noting.
Okay. Matt, I see that you had a question or from someone in the audience. Do you want to go say that?
Yeah, I think James had a question that's kind of relevant to what Brian was talking about, and kind of gets back to, everyone's concerned about the Timothy Johnson killing, and that was whether the policy eliminates the possibility of a human life being taken over theft of a pair of sunglasses or suspicion of shoplifting. I guess additionally, I would ask Brian, what's the threshold for them pursuing someone? I kind of got the impression that basically if they can stop you for suspicion of any crime, they can basically chase you. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah. The first part of the question, was there like a line drawn of, can you pursue someone and shoot and kill them for a shoplifting call? No, there was nothing in the policy that did that. We weren't even trying to aim that high. We were aiming at something much lower than that. Is how complicated the situation was in line drawing. In terms of when you can chase somebody, I tell my clients you have very few constitutional rights on the street, right? A police officer can chase you for any reason. There may be circumstances where if they catch you and they find something illegal on you, they might not be able to use that in court under certain circumstances. There may be certain circumstances under which they hurt you and you may try to be able to sue the police department. But they ought not do it unless they have reasonable suspicion, they have a good reason to believe that you're doing some type of criminal activity. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, that can be as low as you ran from the police, you looked nervous, and you're in what I describe as a high crime neighborhood, which we all know what that's code for. Jeff.
Okay, yeah, I have one more question here from the audience. So, as I understand, the EAT did a lot of research on what the best class, world-class policies would be in a situation like this for foot pursuit policies. How does the FCPD policy differ from some of those examples? Or are there some like really great examples that we should be trying to mirror in localities across the country or wherever?
I think shout out to our colleagues and EAT members at ACLU People Power, who took the deepest possible dive you could imagine into the state of foot pursuit policies around the country. So they use things like the International Association of Chiefs of Police has information on foot pursuit policies. The Stanford Center for Racial Justice has that. There are policies in Chicago and Baltimore that are, I think those were ones that were looked at a lot. There are policies all over the country. And ACO People Power had developed almost like a line by line resource map of ideal policies from all over the country. I think a lot of the response was obviously Fairfax County is not Baltimore, Fairfax County is not Chicago, Fairfax County is not Dallas. Nor are we a more rural jurisdiction where things might be different. So I think we tried to use kind of the more broad ones, the International Association of Chiefs of Police ideas, in the Stanford Center, but as we went forward to try to, were things we found, relating to things nearby us or in Virginia, instead of looking at places that could be easily distinguished, because we were trying to stop them from saying, well, that's great for Baltimore, but we're not Baltimore. That's great for Philly, but we're not Philly. But there's plenty out there. And certainly I'm sure if you contact ACO People Power, they'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Okay. I think this is, I think I've got one more question here from David Puntel, basically asking, we know that we won't have all the data points that we want, but with the data that we are going to have available, what is going to be useful to understand how well the policy is being implemented? Maybe Matt or Brian, either one of us.
I can take that question. I think the number that we always look at is any racial disparities. That's the number one thing we look at. And the issue with that, is that they kind of break it out in a way that doesn't allow us to fully understand the situation. They give us separate plots for race, which is typically Black, white, Asian, and then ethnicity, which is Hispanic, Latino. And then basically what that means, you get a pretty good estimate of what the Hispanic numbers are, but you kind of really have to know that white number is, all those Hispanic numbers are basically white, and you basically have to subtract that from, the race part of it, because the race part of it's white Latino plus white non-Latino. The main issue, even if you do that, the main issue with the data that they provide is that FCPD does not acknowledge that any of those numbers indicate any sort of disparity that they should be concerned about. They will push back and say it's just reflects what the community is doing. We're just policing. They've got no evidence for that. And we say we're concerned about this. We'd like more information. We'd like more data, and they refuse to provide it. I've been working on this for about 5 years now on data specific issues with them. And it's been a constant issue where they will deny disparity, but they will not provide us any additional information to allow us to drill down to figure out what's really going on. I think the things you can look at on the dashboard that are useful are what districts things are happening in. And there's some amount of breakdown of what sorts of reasons for stops that they, are basically chasing people in response to. And the ones that are most concerning to us are things like unprovoked flight, reasonable suspicion, which is kind of the low level, the lowest level acceptable reason to chase someone. There are big disparities in those numbers. And so we can track those, but we can already see there's big, disparities in those. And it's just trying to get somebody to respond in such a way that we can, try to do something about them. And I think that's the main concern is, like, we can see there are issues in the data that's being provided, even though it's not much data as we'd like. And maybe it's not enough data to really make a compelling story. the data is kind of curated by FCPD and it's very high level. But I think it's, we can show that there are concerning numbers and that, somebody, try to force a supervisor to do something about them. It's just a question of whether or not they're going to respond to look
So,
at things more deeply.
Pratik, if I can just jump in here, because there is, I don't want us to make the mistake that many of the responses that we've received have made. There is a real intentionality and a real emphasis on the percentage of recommendations that were received, and there seems to be a spotlight on what some consider the small amount that was not included in the policy. Even in this conversation, now we're talking about the difficulty that exists in terms of making sense of the demographics, the numbers of the data. The question is, if it's difficult for us to make sense of the data now, there's nothing that was done through this process that makes it easier for us. And therein lies the problem. It takes us right back to an issue of trust. We're no closer to understanding, what the numbers really say. And quite frankly, this is because there has even been an inequity in the conversation. There has been an inequity in the conversation. We have been denied an equitable conversation, and so we can spend time talking about what was included, what was not included, but the real issue is how the community, and not just this. I think this is just symptomatic of other issues. What was the response to the community collaborators in this effort? And right now, there is no answer to many of the questions that we're raising. A year from now, who reviews the data? Is it another EAT? What teeth will that EAT have? Will it be the supervisors? Will it be a committee of within the department? Will it be CAC members? Who will review this data? Who will make the determination whether or not this particular policy is effective? And so, having left the table, having left the conversation, incomplete, denies us the opportunity to wrestle with those questions with the individuals who can provide the answers and context and provide a system and structure for us to do it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that totally leads me to my next point in this discussion about what we do in the future. Like for us to like feel the trust in any process going forward, what would you expect from the Board of Supervisors to ensure that the process is followed through? We got the statement from McKay basically saying they'll try better in the future, but what would you do
Well,
to ensure
you
that
know,
happens?
you know, and not to rehash all of the old issues, but we go back to 2021. There was conversation and questions about the hiring of the chief, and then there was an apology for such. There was so many incidents that took place in between the Timothy Johnson murder, and there was apologies about that. So there has to be something more than an apology. There has to be a real conversation about what we can do differently. And when I say what we can do differently, not just us as community members, because we're here, we're at the table. We didn't leave the table. So what are the Board of Supervisors willing to do differently in response to this release etiquette issue? What are they willing to do in response to this abandonment of the process? And I think the Board of Supervisors and not just the chairman, every member of the Board of Supervisors, everyone is elected. So everyone has to stand on his or own feet, and everyone should have a response, because the roundtable is made up of members from each locale, um, and at large. And so every member should give a response about what they believe should be done next. Not just the onus is not just on us as community members, but our job is to hold them accountable for a response. Our job is to highlight the fact that there was this inequity in the conversation. Our job is to, remind them that this occurred and that there have been several apologies. And quite honestly, there have been several apologies, and there's been blood spilled as well. So, when is enough enough?
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And, this is something that Matt and I and like the whole criminal justice committee and the NAACP here at the Fairfax NAACP is working on this conversation. It's just like one step in a lot of future steps. We're
Mhm.
planning on going to Chief Davis at some point in the future, discuss what exactly happened and to ensure, or at least hope for their word that they won't do something like this again, that we have proper process etiquette and we have a proper process in place to make sure all community stakeholders are engaged with, like they said they would. Uh, but yeah, is there any other big topics that you, Pastor Walton or Brian, want to have discussed tonight regarding what happened here today, or any other, or anything from you, Matt, that you think that we should be discussing before we start wrapping it up?
I would just add, that this impacts all of us. As I said, this was the very first EAT, and so I think as the first EAT, um, it set a precedent, and hopefully one that can be addressed and addressed quickly. But I think it will be difficult, to to help people understand that their voice really does matter, and because it's 19 meetings, that's a lot of hours, that's a lot of time, and to totally feel as if your voice or your concerns did not matter, they were not heard, and again, we still don't know the reason why it ended so abruptly. Um, there was never any explanation given. We don't know if there was some internal deadlines or some other clock that was ticking. But minimally, I think members of the EAT, members of the community, deserve a more reasonable response.
Yeah. I,
And
I
member
have a
and member
question.
and member people should ask their supervisors for that response.
Yeah, I see a question here from Emily Dennis asking, can the EAT release any of their recommendations or research? Is that something that you all would eventually be able to provide, or something that people could find?
Um, that's a good question. Um, that's a very good question. I don't have the exact answer to that tonight, but we can certainly ask, about the propriety of those documents. And there is a website, there is a page on the county's website that has our meeting minutes, and so there may be some information there, but I don't think it's specific to all of the recommendations. But certainly that is something that we can inquire about.
Okay,
Okay,
yeah.
is that something the roundtable should kind of? I know this whole process has kind of made the roundtable think about what power they have, what power EATs have.
Right.
Is that something the roundtable needs to kind of take up, as to like the public nature of the recommendations made? I would think they should be made public personally.
Right.
Perhaps the public nature of the data that was provided to us, because we have access to data that's currently not public, but it was given to us. So we could, you know, share that information with the community.
All I'll say is, if you have anything ready for distribution, uh, if you're on the NAACP newsletter down the road, we'll definitely distribute something substantive, like once we get it. But yeah, just keep an eye out on the newsletter if we can, if there's anything we can share.
Mhm.
I mean, I guess if we expand this beyond just the police and foot pursuits, um, I imagine this such a hard process going in with kind of, I would say, a traditionally difficult to work with agency. I think probably prepares the roundtable for future AATs for, how hopefully there are some lessons learned as to how best to deal with situations where information is not being provided or the agency isn't working cooperatively with you. And hopefully other agencies are not so, intransient. Um, but I imagine Pastor Walton and Brian that, you know, this hopefully will prepare us better for future AATs. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or if there's just major concerns about the whole
Right.
process in it of itself.
Well, one thing for certain that, and I understand it's being developed, is that we need a policy that speaks to this kind of impasse, and how that impasse would be handled. Who would be the decision maker if we reach an impasse? At what level does it rise to, if in fact a future EAT finds themselves at this particular place? That's certainly one of the things that we realized was missing in this particular approach. But there's significant conversation around that and what it will look like.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, I'm sure, whatever the next EAT is, police department or non-police department, hopefully people on this call will be on it. And obviously members of the roundtable will obviously be on it. And I think any of us would be happy to talk to the next group deciding what to do and how to do it, about what we learned in a way, EAT member to future EAT member, which I think would be useful compared to what we've.
Tony Zollicoffer, who's the Fairfax Chief Equity Officer, I think, has like to share something or ask something. Do we have the ability to unmute her?
Yeah, I think she should be able to unmute now.
Hi,
She
can
might be
everyone
unmuted.
hear me?
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Oh.
we can hear.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of your conversation. I appreciate the ability to hear and be a part of it. I did want to speak specifically around some of the lessons learned and some of the ways that future EATs would function that would be a little bit different from this time. Pastor Walton mentioned the impasse policy or the impasse procedure. That's ready. We have that ready. We just need to send that to the roundtable. Another thing that I think that we will do at the beginning of an EAT that we didn't do at this time is to really have a very, very concrete, specific conversation with the department that would be requesting an EAT around what community engagement actually looks like and what is the input that particular department wants from the community, so that there's an eyes wide open decision about whether the EAT wants to be a part of that process or not. So a little bit more pre-work and upfront conversation around that. So there are some lessons learned that I think for future EATs that we will be putting in place that will help with the process and make sure that there is communication, shared understanding, and a way to resolve impasses that's in place. The other thing that we requested to the EAT, and at the time, and I think that there's perhaps some value in, but the EAT decided for now not to engage, would be in an after action review of the process to really speak about those things that worked well and those places where it fell apart so that we could incorporate those lessons learned to the EAT moving forward as well. So I did want to chime in and just say that, again, this was our first EAT. There were some places that we could shore up. I don't think that that at all speaks to the issues at hand in terms of the relationship between FCPD and the EAT. I'm certainly not suggesting that what we would do differently would have mitigated that. I did just want to chime in that there are things that we can do to make it better in the future. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, the floor to say that.
Yeah, thank you for speaking, Tony. Yeah, it's great to hear your perspective, and there's definitely a lot more that could be done to ensure a smoother process going forward to make sure all stakeholders are heard and to make sure the community feedback is taken seriously. Uh, but yeah, is there anything else from you, Pastor Walton, Matt, Brian?
I would just like to add that Tony and other folks on the county staff, Lisa K, Boateng, and Ramona Carroll, who I saw was also on this call, were extraordinarily helpful to the AT in setting up, conducting, and and running meetings. And I don't know how many hours, and also like working on our documents to make them presentable to the police department. I have no idea how many hours they worked on it, but I'm sure they were not paid for all those hours. So I think we were all really appreciative of the work that they did. I think we have one more question. It's actually for Tony. And it's from Adrian Steele, who's also on the EAT. He was wondering if the recommendations and other materials from the EAT would be releasable under FOIA. I don't know if you know the answer to that question, Tony.
You're
On mute.
muted.
Now I'm not. Thank you. The host was needed to allow me to speak. So yes, under FOIA, but we were also going to release a summary document on the Roundtable's website anyway around the recommendations along with the EAT members. So that summary document we were going to release to the public. But of course, other information, because the Roundtable is not considered a BAC, that information would not, that information, I mean, any information between county employees and the public are FOIable, but the working within the EAT, because it's not a BAC, you would have to formally request a FOIA for that, but we will put on the roundtable a summary of the recommendations and the work of the EAT along with the EAT members. So that will be something that we will publish, and you'll be able to find that. We can send the link, Matt, to NAACP so that it could be easy for people to find that report.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Adrian, did that answer your question?
He'll bug you later if it didn't. You know that.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't see any more questions on my end. I think it's about time to wrap this up. Thank you, Pastor Walton and Brian, for taking the time to come tonight and discussing such an important topic. And I just want to end by saying, it is really important, this foot pursuit policy. Timothy Johnson died because of it, and doing anything we can to stop someone who shouldn't die is something we should definitely be focused on. We should definitely be fighting for better policies to prevent needless violence and needless bloodshed going forward, to make sure the people in our community can stay alive when they don't need to die. it's really a policy that's of the utmost importance, in my opinion. So I think it's about time to end. Thank you, everyone here, for taking an hour or so of your night to come tonight and listening to us talk about the foot pursuit policy and the EAT. And yeah, hope to see you all at future Fairfax NAACP events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.